Well, as I'm just speaking, the guys are going to bring some stuff out for me, which is going to be really helpful. But this evening, we're centered around the thought of, have you ever read the Bible? Have you ever read, particularly in the Gospels, where you've read something that Jesus said or did, and it kind of made your head tilt a bit, and you were like, Jesus did what? He said what? He went where? What happened in that moment? And that happens to me quite frequently. I maybe it's just me, and I just don't know the Bible very well, and you're all very wonderful. But for me, often I find myself looking at what Jesus says and going, that seems quite rude sometimes. Sometimes it seems a bit harsh. Sometimes it seems a little bit like I'm missing something. There's something lost in translation. And it often feels to me a little bit like this. So have a little look at this clip. And this is, I think, sometimes what it feels like when we read the Bible.
You know, back then I was a little baby, sweet and greasy. Gotta love bread.
I know. You know, there's sandwich bread over there next to the coffee.
I eat bread in the bathtub.
Okay, that's gross to me. There's a lot I've been feeling lately.
Why is there a hearse at my house? Night screams, the new fun of the kids. Billy, my Billy. Billy, where are you, Billy? So I need to talk to you regarding money. I stomped on all the fun chunks. My grief has a scent, like suffering.
A rusty navel? How'd it get rusty?
Look at this bug.
It's an honor to meet you, my lord.
Winkle, winkle, wink, whittle ghost, and kiss a pickle as you haunt your tree. Hey.
Awesome. I love that. I warn you now, if you start looking for that on YouTube, you will end up down a rabbit hole. So I don't recommend it. But I think sometimes that's what happens. It feels a little bit like there's some bad lip reading going on. We think that one thing is being said, but it looks like something else is happening. And we know from that clip that is not what they were singing in that moment. I don't know what they were saying, some sort of play, but it was not that. And I think sometimes when we come to Scripture, and particularly in the Gospels, we can read something and it'd be a little bit like bad lip reading, a little bit like, well, we don't kind of fully understand what's going on, and so we misinterpret it, or we kind of put what we think is going on onto it, and it's so different than how it was fully intended to be. And so that's what we're going to look at this evening, a story that I think often we bad lip read. And hopefully that's going to help us in our everyday life, and we'll pull that through. So shall we pray together, and then we'll get into the Word of God. Father, we just thank you for your Word. We thank you that it's rich and wonderful and true. And so, Lord, help us this evening to appreciate your Word, to honor your Word, and for it to help change us and how we go into our week this week. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Well, we're going to look at a story where somebody gets really offended. And as I was kind of texting out my little focus group this week, I've got a little group of people in church that are all different ages and stages and things like that. And I text them sometimes if I need some help with my preach. And so I asked them, what are some of the stories with Jesus that really confuse you? Where you feel like Jesus is being harsh, or where he said something and you really, really don't understand what he's saying. And we're going to look at that story in just a moment. But I found it really interesting that Jesus himself says that we're going to be offended by him. Which you may not know that Jesus said that, but he did. He said that in Matthew 11, verse 6. He says this, "Blessed is he who is not offended because of me." So Jesus seems to know already that it's in our nature that we can get offended, that we can take offense, that we can misread what's going on in this scenario. And the little bit of backstory for this is that even Jesus' cousin, so his family, somebody who should have known him really well, was getting offended by what was happening, because he'd spent his life setting up and prepping for the ministry of Jesus, and yet he found himself in prison going, was it all worth it? Did I misinterpret this? Did I get this wrong? And so he sends his disciples to Jesus and says, Jesus, was it a waste of time? Did I get this wrong? And Jesus goes back to him and says, no, listen, the blind see, the lame walk, the dead are being raised. It's all right. You're on the right track. But blessed is he who is not offended because of me. So Jesus seems to know that it's usual for us to get offended, and for us to bad lip read, and for us to not really understand what's going on in the moment. And there's 4 thoughts that I want to present to us tonight. And I'm going to do it right at the start so that hopefully as we read this story, you can see these threads pulling through. And the first is this, is that we always, all of us, have the opportunity for offense. Offense is always going to come. And so try not to think big offense, like, family breakdown, I'm not going to speak to you for 20 years, and then we'll have a punch-up over the coffin kind of offense. Think like small, little niggly offenses, like somebody cutting you off on your way to Woolies in the car, that sort of thing. All of us, every day, every week, week in, week out, if you talk to a person, and even if you don't talk to a person in a day, you can be offended by yourself. So all of us have opportunity to be offended. Second thought is this, is that offense happens when we start to judge intention. So when we begin to judge somebody's intentions, our intentions, God's intentions, that's where we've created a perfect environment for offense. The third thought is this, is that our name is not on the judgment seat. Here's my judgment seat tonight. I was sitting on this in a little bit. But our name is not on this seat. And we'll find out why in a moment. And the last thought is this, is that the counteract to offense and to judgment in our life is to weight the scales with grace. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we're going to go old school tonight. We're going to read together. So it's going to be up on the screen. We're going to do a bit of audience participation. We are all going to read out loud together. So everyone just have a little cough. Clear voice. Good. All right. Here we go. We're reading from Matthew 15, and we're starting in verse 21. Here we go. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is Mine says it the other way around, but well done." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs." "Yes, Lord," she said, "but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed from the very hour. At that very moment, or the hour. Yeah, it happened straight away. So this is one of the stories that people texted back and were like, "What is going on?" And this story has always puzzled me because, and I was reading lots of commentaries about it this week, and one commentator just put it brilliantly. He was like, no matter how you massage this text, no matter how you look at it from whatever angle, Jesus still calls this woman a dog in the middle of the text, which is pretty offensive. Can we just agree that if you did that in your workplace to your boss or to people or to the cashier in Woolies, that would probably not be a good thing for us to do. So what's going on and why is it happening? And so just as we start to look through, just a bit of context for you, it's always good for you to look at what's happening just before so you can understand what's happening. And so literally in the verses just before this, just before they go into Tyre and Sidon, Jesus and his disciples and the Pharisees are all having a big barney. So they're all getting cross with each other, and the Pharisees are saying, "Oh, you should do it this way." And Jesus is saying, no, you guys have got it wrong. It's not what you put in your mouth that makes you unclean. It's what comes out of your mouth that makes you unclean. The disciples are like, "Oh, did he just say that?" And Jesus is like, "Yes, I did." And then the disciples go to Jesus and say, "Jesus, do you realize you've just offended the Pharisees?" And Jesus is like, and then, get this, because we're all talking about offense tonight. And then Peter says to Jesus, "Explain the parable." And Jesus says, blunt as, "Are you still so dull?" Jesus asked them. So there's lots of kind of offense going on. And then they all go out to Tyre and Sidon. And then what happens is that a Canaanite woman comes to him. Now you have to understand a little bit about why the writers put that in. So Matthew is writing, and he's writing a letter to Jews. So he's trying to explain to Jewish people, listen, Jesus is the person that we've been looking for, the one that we've been waiting for. He's the one. And so Matthew's writing his gospel to Jewish people. And so that when they're hearing this, you've got to try and hear it a little bit through Jewish ears. So when a Canaanite woman comes and has a conversation, they're not just like, oh, nice, a Canaanite woman. The Jewish people now have an opportunity to be offended because they don't like the Canaanites. Canaanites have been cursed since right at the start of the Bible. In Genesis, Noah, Canaan was originally one of Noah's sons. Noah curses Canaan and says, Canaan, you're going to be a slave to your brother for the rest of your days. The Canaanites should have actually been wiped out by the children of Israel, but they didn't obey God. And so they've become this nation, and they're a group of people who worship other gods, and they're like the worst of the worst of the worst. And so this woman, and she's a woman, so oh dear for her being born female in that time. So she's the worst of the worst, and she's a woman, and she comes and talks to them. So this is like a trio of no-nos. So she comes up and says, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. Now for us, we're like, lovely. If you're a Jewish listener listening to this, and you were eating something, you'd drop it. Or if you had a mic, you'd drop it. Or whatever you had in your hand, you'd be dropping it at this moment. Because she's just made the first overt messianic claim in Matthew. She's the first person in Matthew to attribute Jesus as the Messiah. And it's come out of the mouth of a woman, which is really bad at that time. And worse still, it's come out of the mouth of a Canaanite woman. It's like, oh my goodness. So for us, we just gloss over that. But for the listeners, they're like so triggered and offended, it's not even funny. They're like, what is going on? So that's kind of where we're up to. And she says, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. So everybody's now got the opportunity for being offended. The disciples could be offended. The listeners could be offended. We're not, because it doesn't really affect us very much. And then she says this, my daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly. And then get this, Jesus did not answer a word. Think how awkward that scenario is. We're all walking together, and then the woman comes out to them and says, I've got this awful problem. My daughter, she's demon-possessed. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus says nothing. Not, oh, that's really terrible. I'm sorry to hear that. What's her name? How long has that happened? There. All the things you would expect Jesus, gentle, meek, and mild to do. He doesn't do any of that, and he says nothing. If I came up to you or you came up to me and I told you about the most terrible thing going on in my life, and I was like, I really need your help in this, have mercy on me, and I said nothing, or you said nothing, and just carried on walking, I'm kind of guessing we'd be offended in that moment. If Pastor Mark blanked you after you just poured your heart out to him and were like, it's so terrible, I need your help, and he was like, thinking you may be ringing Jacinta for a pastoral appointment at that point, because there's the opportunity to be offended. And why is that happening? Why is there the opportunity in that moment for her and for us? And it's because in that moment, there's the judging of intentions. We haven't got a clue why Jesus said nothing to her in that moment. We don't know. But if we start to judge Jesus' intentions, that, oh, maybe he was too busy, maybe he didn't care, maybe he didn't hear, maybe he didn't care because she was a woman, maybe he thought that she was beneath him. If we start to then judge the silence, judge what was going on, if we start to put intentions into that when we really don't know, that's when we're ripe for being offended. And you can bad lip read silence, which is an anathema, really, that you would think it's only when somebody says something to you that you can bad lip read it and get offended. But we're all really good at this. Like, for the example, when you're driving in your car and the world is going wonderfully, and then somebody in a ute, like, because it always is, isn't it? Sorry, ute drivers, but it's usually you. And speed down and they barrel in and then they start going, doing that little thing across all the lanes, and they've not said a word. You haven't had a conversation, but now you're offended and you're upset for all the drivers because it's not safe, is it? It's not safe for everybody else. You're offended on behalf of all of the drivers on the road. You don't know. It's not good. There could be children in these cars and you don't know and you're driving like this. It's not good. And you start to get offended. Or if you come into church and maybe you see a friend and they look at you, but they don't smile, they just go to their seat. You've not said anything, but you've got the opportunity to bad lip read and be offended in that moment. When Jesus is really quiet, I often find that's when I can really, really bad lip read Jesus. When I've asked him for something, when I keep asking him for something, when I've come and said, Jesus, I've got this really big problem and I need you to come through for me, and Jesus is frustratingly quiet in that moment. I can bad lip read what he's not saying. I can put my intentions onto him. I can think that he doesn't care and he's not interested and he's not on time and he should have done this quicker, and I can put all of my intentions onto Jesus and I'm starting to judge Jesus. It's a pretty dangerous place to be. And what happens is that when we have the opportunity for offense, as soon as we start judging intentions, we come and we sit in the judgment seat. We then make a decision that actually I know what's going on. I know what that person meant. I know why they didn't talk to me. I know why they took so long to reply to my texts. I know why they couldn't come round to my house. I know why the boss said that to me that way. I know why that friend isn't behaving like they used to. And so as soon as we sit down in the judgment seat and say, I know what's going on, we're in big trouble. Because we're judging intentions in this moment. And we have neither the knowledge or the authority to judge anything. We don't have a clue what's going on. The more and more I live life on the planet, the more I realize I have no idea about anything. I don't know what's going on in my own body most of the time. I don't even know my own thoughts. I can't distinguish sometimes my own intentions. And yet somehow I think that I'm qualified to come and sit here and judge what's going on for other people, why they've done things, why Jesus is taking his time. I find myself feeling like I'm qualified to come and sit in this seat, and I'm not. Because I don't have the knowledge and the authority to sit there. Only Jesus does. We have no idea what's going on for people. We have no idea what Jesus is doing. When there's silence and when there's quiet, or when Jesus is doing something that we really don't understand, be really careful not to come and sit in his seat, because we really, really don't know what God is doing. And that's apparently okay with him. He's really all right with that. We're not okay with it because we feel like we should know, but he's apparently all right with it. So then the story continues in verse 24. So she's come and said her piece, and then the disciples are getting offended now because they're upset. Because so the disciples come to Jesus and say, listen, can you send this woman away because she keeps crying out after us? So they've now, for whatever reason, decided that they've had enough. And they've come to Jesus and said, can you just get rid of this woman? It's got shades of when the blind guy is calling out after Jesus. It's got hints of that in the story. And Jesus answers them. I always thought Jesus answered her in this moment, but he doesn't. He answers the disciples and says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel, which is random because that's got nothing to do with anything. They didn't ask that question. They didn't say, Jesus, who were you sent to again? Oh, yes, you were sent to the lost sheep of Israel. They just said, can you send her away? And then Jesus seems to say this totally random thought about, no, I'm sent to the lost sheep of Israel. And it's this lovely term of endearment from Jeremiah, that where God calls his people lost sheep. And then Jesus later on talks about being the good shepherd and leaving the 99 and going to find the one. And it's this beautiful imagery where Jesus is saying, guys, I'm here primarily for Israel. That's who I'm here for whilst I'm on the earth. That's who my primary call is to at this moment. But the woman, she's still not satisfied with what's going on. So she comes along and she kneels before Jesus and she says again, Lord, help me. And then we get to the crux of the story, which is where this just unbelievable sentence is said by Jesus. And he replies, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. That sounds fairly harsh, doesn't it? Can we just agree that on first reading, that doesn't look nice? So if you asked me to do something, or if you asked me for something, I was like, no, you dog. Like, that's, when we read it on first glance, we've really got the opportunity to be offended. And I think often when Jesus said something that we don't understand, when he asks us to do something that we don't understand, we've got the opportunity to be offended. We've got the opportunity to start reading into his intentions. We've got the opportunity to start coming and sitting here thinking that we know what's going on, but we really don't. We don't know what's going on in this moment. And it's really interesting what's happening here. So she could be offended. We could be offended for her. I've always thought, this is really harsh, Jesus. Why did you call this woman a dog? And we've got a major, major bad lip reading moment in the Bible. But what's happening here is so clever when you look into it. When you understand what Jesus is doing and what he's saying to her and what she then says to him, it's just genius level stuff, as it would be because it's Jesus, because he is super clever. But it's just amazing when you really know what's going on. And so for us to understand that, it's really difficult for us to grasp this because we're Western. We grow up with a Western way of thinking, a Western mindset, in fact, quite a Greek way of looking at things in the world. It's that way of kind of thinking and analyzing and right and wrong and all that kind of stuff. But the way that the Jews grew up was in an Eastern mindset. And so when they had rabbis, it was really common for them to pull out riddles and stories and like call and response and like ways of doing things, and often silence. Like silence, what we see Jesus just did a couple of verses earlier, that's a really common rabbinic way of helping somebody along in their journey, which sometimes I used to do as a teacher. Where there'd be a kid and they'd come and maybe it was something like, I don't know, they'd be like, Miss, I can't do 8 + 2. And they'd be like, no, you can, because we were doing number bonds to 10. I'd be like, no, you can. And so then they'd be like, all right, or they'd try and find all the ways that they could make 10. And then they'd be like, I've got it. And they'd come to me and I'd be like, have you? And then they'd be like, you see the little seed of doubt in their head, they'd be like, I don't know if I have or not. So then they'd start looking and they'd be like, is it 4 + 9? And I wouldn't say anything. And then they'd be like, and they'd keep going and I'd keep being quiet because it would make them think and answer and think and answer and think and answer. And actually my silence helped them work their way through till they got to it. And then they got a gold star and it was all good and we were all happy. So that's a really common way that rabbis used to teach. And in this moment, Jesus is doing this kind of call and response, a little bit like throwing out a fishing line with a bit of bait on it, really hoping that the other person is going to bite it and kind of pull it in. It's that sort of exchange that's happening, which we don't really do in our Western way of teaching and thinking, but is really common at the time. And so when we read this verse, I want you to read it as if Jesus has got like a twinkle in his eye. Because often we read this like harsh Jesus. No, I'm going to give you food to the dogs. Which is not Jesus, is it? We know Jesus. We love him. He's not mean and nasty. So I want you to read it again, but see Jesus with a twinkle in his eye, throwing out a line to this woman, saying, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Because he's like, throwing out a line, really hoping she's going to pick it up, which is still really difficult because it's not how our culture does it. So I'm going to help you out, and I'm going to have to sing for this. I know, me and Neil debated about this all week. So you have to be kind to me because this is going to be on the internet forever, all right? So don't leave me hanging. So I will only do this if you promise, hand on your heart, everybody now, promise, do not leave me hanging in this moment. Thank you, Amore. I see that hand. Good. All right. So I'm going to sing something, and you are instinctively going to know what to sing back to me. All right? Are you all ready? Yes. Now remember, this is not our seat to sit in. So don't judge me. All right? So if I sing to you, I don't want a lot for Christmas. Yes, well done, everybody. Awesome. And that's what's going on in this moment. Call and response. You know what comes next because I threw the line out to you. Now, if we went to a random culture and I sang that to them and they had no idea about Mariah Carey or that it's the greatest Christmas song of all time, if they didn't know that and I just sang it to them, well, first they'd think I was pretty weird because I'm a random lady just singing at them. But if they didn't have the context of the song and I just sang to them, I don't want a lot for Christmas, they'd be like, all right, one present for you then. Because they don't know the context. And it's a little bit like that here. Jesus throws out the line, I don't want a lot for Christmas. It's not right to take the kids' bread and feed it to the dogs. Jesus is setting it up for a comeback line. And when it's the word dogs, there's two ways that you can read that. And the first is, which is not the word that's written here, the first is like a wild, think like a flea-bitten, probably got rabies, running around sort of dog that you don't really want in your house. And because Jews hated dogs, which is really sad for them, but they hated dogs. They were not household pets. They wouldn't have had pets around. But it's not that word. It's the word for puppies, which is just so cute. Yeah, I know. So Jesus is saying it's like puppies or like pups or floofs, if you like the internet. And so Jesus is saying to her, do you really want me to take a meal that I've prepared for kids and give it to the puppies because they're being really cheeky around the table? Because you know when puppies are puppies and they just want to eat everything and they just like yapping at you and they paw at you and they've got those big eyes and it's super cute and you want to feed them everything but you can't because it's bad for them and all that kind of stuff. Think about that as the context. So Jesus throws out the line to her, do you really want me to take the kids' food that I've already prepared and do you want me to give it to the puppies that are being really naughty around the table? And she says, no, of course not. She comes back with this amazing zinger. She picks up the line. She sings back to Jesus, there's just one thing I need. Like she just sings it perfectly. And she says, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. That's really hard for us to understand because we're like, all right, so the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. It still doesn't make sense to us. But when you understand that what she's saying in this moment is this amazing statement of faith in who Jesus is and his abundance and his ability to provide. And what she's basically saying is, listen, Jesus, you're so good. I recognize who you are, that I can see you can prepare a meal for the whole family as the master of the house with a puppy around. So in the Greek culture, they had like household dogs that would come and be fed by from the hand of the master. And she's saying, Jesus, you're so good that you can prepare a meal and the kids can have their fill. So I'm not asking for the kids' food, but it can be so abundant, it can be so amazing that off the table are falling all these crumbs, and even the puppies get crumbs, don't they? Even the puppies in that moment, they get to pick up the crumbs. And so she's making this incredible statement of faith, which is why Jesus says to her, woman, you've got great faith. Because that's what she's saying. This is an amazing statement from her saying, I recognize that such is your grace, such is your mercy. I don't need you to take something that was meant for the Jews and let them miss out on it and give it to me, because you're so good, you're so abundant, you're so full of grace, you're so full of mercy that it's going to flow over to me, and I don't even have to beg for it because it's going to flow over, because even the pups get crumbs. Even the pups get the things that come off the table because there's such an abundance. She doesn't need to beg because of the overflow. And her answer in that moment releases breakthrough, releases healing. It heals her daughter. The statement of faith that comes from her mouth about the abundance and the grace and the mercy of Jesus releases healing. And so Jesus is super impressed and says, woman, you've got great faith. And all the listeners are now triggered and offended because nobody so far has been said that they've had great faith. And a Canaanite woman has been said that they had great faith. And Jesus has repeatedly said up to this point, ye of little faith, to lots of Jewish people and lots of the disciples. So if you're listening to this as a first century Jew, you're like, oh no, she's got great faith and we're sucking at this for so far. So the disciples have got this massive opportunity now for offense again, to judge her intentions, to sit in the judgment seat and to do that. And so that's what's going on in this. And we can so easily miss it if we bad lip read. If we start to put intentions and we start to read intentions into things that aren't there, we can so easily miss what's going on in a moment, and we can take a seat that we've never been meant to sit in. So how does this help you on Wednesday? It's a lovely explanation of the story, but how do you apply this to your Wednesday afternoon with your boss and your crabby family and things that are going on? How do you apply it? How does it make it any different? Well, the antidote to judgment is grace. And so when we find ourselves wanting to come and sit here and to start to read intentions and to think that we know what's going on for people, or to think that we know what's going on with what God's doing in our life, or to think that we know what's going on for that person who's been really rude to us this week, when we are tempted to come and start sitting here and reading those intentions and making those judgments, remember the antidote to that is grace. And I read this really interesting story this week that perfectly illustrates this. And it's about a guy called Charles Swindoll, who's quite a famous guy. And he was doing this like a series long, like a conference, I suppose. And a middle-aged guy and his wife came to the conference and managed to meet with Charles before the conference started and said, we're so excited to be here. We've saved up all our money. We're just so excited. And he was like, great. And then they sat in the sessions, and so he noticed them because they'd had this conversation. And so the husband and the wife are sitting next to each other, and the wife's really attentive. She's taking notes. She's leaning in. She looks like she's listening. But the husband, by the end of the preach, is falling asleep. Not just once, but every single session. And so he starts to look for him and go, is he sleeping in this one? Yeah, he is, which is not as uncommon as you'd think, to be honest. So he's sleeping. And so Charles starts to think, well, what is going on here? Why can't this guy stay awake in my sermons? I'm like, preaching my heart out here. And why can't you stay awake? And he starts to think, well, maybe this woman is kind of more devoted and the husband is, just saying that he is, but actually he's really not. And maybe he's like pretending to be a Christian, and he starts putting all of these assumptions, all of these things that he thinks might be going on. And so he's getting really offended at this guy, to the point where he's super offended every time this guy falls asleep. Until the wife comes to him at the end of the conference and says, without a husband there, and says, we just want to thank you so much for your ministry this week. It's just been amazing. And I just wanted to let you know that this has been a bit of a bucket list item for myself and my husband, because my husband has got terminal cancer and he's dying. And this was one of the things that he wanted to do with some of the last of our money and the last of his time. And but he's so heavily medicated that he can't stay awake for long periods of time. How awful do you feel if you're Charles Swindoll in that moment? You're feeling super bashful. And we've all had that, haven't we? We've all had that moment where we've been like, I think I know what's going on. And you make your judgment, and then you find out later something, and you're like, oh no, I'm a horrible person. That sucks. And what I found really interesting, I found stories this week of this group that happens even now, of these Jewish people who meet together every week in Jerusalem. And what they do is they bring all of the things that triggered them the week. They bring all of their offenses, all of the things that really niggled them, all the things that happened. And then as a group, they discuss it and they try to make up reasons why that thing happened. So say, you've got your ute driver that cut you off on the way to work, and he's been doing it every morning because you're all there, on the same kind of road. Well, the group would say, maybe Mr. Ute driver, maybe he has a sick daughter in hospital in the Royal Brisbane, and maybe he's trying to get through that traffic really quickly to go and see his daughter. Maybe that's what's going on. Or maybe he's got a really horrible boss that is just on him all the time, and so he's just needing to get in really early because he needs to do some extra work to help the boss because he's really afraid that he's going to lose his job. And they make up all of these reasons, which some of you in the room now are thinking that is ridiculous because people are just rubbish sometimes and you shouldn't excuse them because the ute drivers are a bane on the life of society. Like, we can think that. But as ridiculous are our that group's kind of made up reasons why they've done that, that's as ridiculous as our judgments that we make in this seat. Because they're still, both of them, totally unfounded on any knowledge or authority. What you decide here in this seat negatively to do with why somebody did something and why they looked at you that way and why they've done that and why Jesus is doing it is as uninformed as you thinking the very best. My mum does this really, really well. So if anything has happened or somebody's being really mean or something's happened, her stock reply will be, their cat may have died that morning. Which is fine and fun when you're, yeah, all right, for your dog may have died that morning for all the dog people that were like, I don't care, whatever. Yeah. So, which is fun, but sometimes that gets really irritating. And you're like, well, their cat may have died, but that still doesn't mean that they get to do what they did. But the judgments that we make negatively are just as silly as, do you know what, let's give them the benefit of the doubt because their cat might have died that morning. They're as uninformed. So do we want to sit here and be negative, or do we want to believe the best in people? Do we want to err on the side of grace? And before we slip into this, I think it's really, really important that we don't apply at this juncture the way that the world would think onto this circumstance. Because the world would deal with this by saying something like this. We just need to assume most people are good. Most people are trying their best. And there's nice little Instagram quotes that have probably got a nice background that say something like this. Everybody is dealing with something that you know nothing about. So be kind. That's kind of how the world looks at this. With the opportunity to be offended, the world would say, let's just assume, let's give everybody the benefit of the doubt. Let's give everybody a kind of a free pass card. Let's give everybody, let's just assume the best out of everybody, which is comforting and a nice way to look at it. And it would sell lots of books, but it's not a biblical way to look at it. Because what the Bible would say is, I'm a sinner, you're a sinner, everybody is dealing with sin, so let's be gracious to them. Not, it's, everybody's basically good. That is an entirely foreign thought to the Bible. You won't find that in the Bible, no. The Bible says nobody's righteous, not even one. And so it's not that we need to just apply niceness to everybody, because at some point your niceness tank will run out, because you'll be like, I don't feel like being nice anymore, and that person doesn't deserve my niceness, and what they're doing isn't nice, and the consequences of what they've done is horrible, and I can't just be nice to them. But if you can recognize that we're all sinners, all of us, and what we all need is grace, then that shifts it. That shifts how we start to interact with things. James 4:12 says this, there is only one lawgiver and judge, there is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy, but who are you to judge your neighbor? It's not up to us to judge. It's not up to us to come and take this seat and sit in it and decide what's going on for people. It's not up for us to do that. That seat only belongs to Jesus. It only has his name on it. We do a really poor job when we sit here because we don't have the knowledge or the authority to be able to do it well, but Jesus does. He has all the knowledge and all the authority, and so he gets to sit here and do what he does best. Only Jesus has his name on the seat. But when we're being offended, when the opportunity for offense comes, when the opportunity to be offended presents itself, which it will this week, what I want us to do is this. I want us to think about the measure that we use. There's a 120 years before Jesus, a rabbi said this: judge each person with the scales weighted in their favor. And then Jesus looked at it like this. He reworked it and he said, in Luke 6:38, with the measure you use, it's going to be measured back to you. He said it another way: love your neighbor as yourself. It's not assuming everybody's good. No, no one's good. None of us are righteous. We all need grace. So judge with grace, since you know that you're a sinner too. So when you get the opportunity to be offended, don't just give somebody the benefit of the doubt, because that will run out at some point and be like, oh, well, they're a good person. No, they're not. But neither are you. None of us are good. We all need grace. And so when I'm tempted to bad lip read, what I want you to do, when you're tempted to bad lip read, is I want you to do this. I want you to get out the grace. I want you to get out grace. Now, if I could have found a 50-kilo bag, I would have got a 50-kilo bag, but I wouldn't have been able to lift it. So this is the biggest bag that I could probably lift and keep on the stage. But I want you to think about the grace that you've been given. Now, this is like a small representation. We could fill this room with the grace that you and I have been given. We could fill Olympic swimming pools. We could fill Australia. We could fill the Tasman Ocean. We could fill a lot of stuff. We could fill the world with the measure of grace that's been given to us. And so when offense comes, when the opportunity to be offended comes, we can do two things. You can get a small measure. And you can go, yep, I've been given grace. All right, this person's really, really annoying me. All right, here's some grace for you. There we go. I've done my duty. Thank you, Jesus. Give me a pat on the back. I'm not sat in this seat. There's my grace. And you can do that. And that's good. That's fine. You can give them a little bit of grace. But Jesus is really clear and says, with the measure you use, so it's going to be measured to you. So when it comes to you needing some grace, which you've got access to all the grace, all the dog kibbles in the world, you have access to. But because of the measure that you've used, a bit of grace for you. So instead of using tiny measures, when the opportunity to be offended comes, instead of getting out the smallest and giving the little bit of grace and going, well, I suppose they may have had a bad upbringing. Well, I suppose Jesus may know what he's doing. Well, I suppose that person has good intentions. Instead of using small measures, let me encourage you, when the opportunity comes, get a big measure. Go big or go home. Get a big measure and decide that what you're going to do in that moment when you feel offended is you're going to give out grace. You're going to give out as much grace as you can. Because the woman recognized because of her faith, even the dogs get crumbs. Even the dogs, because of the abundance and the grace and the overflow and what Jesus has done, there is so much crumbs going on for everybody. You've been given the full meal. As children of God, you and I have the full meal. We don't have to fight for scraps. We don't have to do that. And this woman recognized, listen, God is so good. His grace is so amazing. His favor is so good. The fruitfulness is so much. We don't have to be stingy with our measure. We don't have to just get a little bit. We can stock up, and every day we can just be like, all right, here's some more grace. Here's some more grace. You need some grace? All right, let's get some grace for you. More grace. And we can pour and pour and pour and never run out. You can't exhaust God's grace. And with the measure you use for somebody else, so it gets measured to you. So be really generous. Be overly generous. Go big or go home. Get it out and start pouring it out. And I love that this woman saw that. She understood. She had such the opportunity to be like, Jesus, you just called me a dog in front of people. She could have been super triggered, super offended, and been like, do you know what? This isn't worth it. Off I go. But she recognized what Jesus was doing. He was throwing her a line. He had a twinkle in his eye. Are you going to get this? Are you going to pick it up? Are you going to understand? Are you going to see what I'm doing here in this moment? And I wonder how many times do we miss what's going on in our life because we bad lip read Jesus and we see the circumstance and we don't see that Jesus is actually throwing us a line. Are you going to get it? Are you going to understand? Are you going to see that my grace is abundant? Are you going to see that there's an overflow of mercy? Are you going to see that kids get fed and crumbs go everywhere for everybody? And so just be really generous with your grace. So I wonder, are we going to do that? Are we going to see that? Could the band come up, please? That's not to say, and this is really important, that when we're giving out grace, that negates healthy boundaries. So that's really important. Because if in this there's abuse of power and all sorts of things, healthy boundaries are fine, but we can still give grace with healthy boundaries. And so that's really important for you to understand. If you struggle, if you're thinking, yes, but this person continually does this, then you can still have good boundaries with somebody, good emotional and healthy boundaries, and still give grace to them, but also keep yourself safe. You can do that. But the call and the challenge for us is, when we have the opportunity to be offended this week, when it comes, because it's going to come, are we going to decide in that moment to come and sit in the seat that doesn't have our name on it, and to use authority and knowledge that is not ours, that we don't have, and to sit here and make judgments on people and decide their intentions and think that we know what's going on? Are we going to sit here, or are we going to decide, no, I'm going to go and get a load of grace? I'm going to go get my measure out. I'm not going to use a tiny, stingy measure. I'm going to get a big measure, because I need a big measure. I need a big measure. I mess up all the time. And I want Jesus to be really gracious to me, because I make mistakes and I need lots and lots of grace. If I want lots and lots of grace, then I'm going to go and use lots and lots of grace for other people.